So let's have a look at the opening of scene 3 in Streetcar. And I would always suggest with Streetcar, because of the way that the play is structured, look closely at the ending of the scene before. The scenes fit together. It's not designed to have an interval. And in the same way that Blanche's understanding of time gets quite blurred, I think Williams manipulates the audience through the scenes and the way that they fit together. So time seems to kind of stop and start and become quite elastic. We seem to go from talking about the poker game happening scene to it happening already. And notice that we've got the street seller at the end of scene 2 shouting out about red hot peppers for sale. Now, Blanche has just been told by Stanley that Stella is having a baby, and it says that she reacts to that by saying, oh, dreamily, oh, my sister's going to have a baby. But that's quite a shocking revelation for her, a reminder that she's not had any children, that she's getting older, that she's going to be almost removed one step away potentially from Stella's affections. And then you get these street sellers calling out, and notice that whenever you get the influence of external forces like the street sellers, the young boy, sound coming in from outside, both diegetic and non-diegetic, it's indicative of a mental strain on Blanche. So we've got these voices coming into the scene bothering her, and now it's the poker night. So this is significant, I think, because the poker night is the only scene which is given a name. And you might want to think about why. What is the significance of poker in the play? So it's a really interesting symbol, and I don't know if any of you are keen poker players, I hope not too keen, but in poker you have to bluff. So that means you have to pretend that you've got cards that you haven't, or that you have cards that you don't. That's the same thing, isn't it? But you know what I mean. So the idea is to kind of kid your opponent that you have got a particular hand of cards that you may or may not really have. And that, of course, is indicative, firstly, of Blanche bluffing, but also maybe these men. When we look at this description in a minute of the beginning of the poker scene, we'll see it's all about machismo, you know, a way of being masculine, which is almost quite toxic in this play. And is that a bluff? Is the idea of what a man is like in the play a bluff? So we begin with didactic stage directions again, with Williams being very, very exacting about what he expects to see on stage. But if you think about it, it's really strange. He says, there is a picture of Van Gogh's of a billiard parlour at night. The kitchen now suggests that sort of lurid nocturnal brilliance. Now look at that closely. And a lot of people read this and suggest that this picture is in the kitchen. But if it were, the audience wouldn't really be able to see it, would they? And I do recommend that you Google it and have a look at the picture. We've looked at it in class, but have a look at the actual picture. And you'll see that it's very blurred. As with all Impressionist paintings, it's not meant to be entirely realistic. It's meant to give you the feelings in the room, and the feelings are of despair and loneliness, but also excitement through the blurred colours, and the idea of the game of billiards. Billiards is a game played a bit like snooker, something like that. But notice he said there is a picture, but he doesn't say in the kitchen. A lot of people read it that way. I think he means that when you think about this scene, think about this picture and relate it to this picture. So again, we've got a kind of surrealism here through the stage directions, a suggestion that this scene is reminiscent. It now suggests this picture. Now, as well as bringing surrealism into the stage directions, which is quite unusual, you've got an intertextual reference here where one text refers to another. And it makes a certain assumption, doesn't it, about the audience or the reader. Williams is assuming that the audience of this play, and remember it's also a play that's meant to be read, so a reader of this play will be familiar with Van Gogh and they will be familiar with this picture. So and remember that, of course, when the play was produced in 1947, the audience then, or the reader then, wouldn't have been able to Google it. So he's assuming a certain amount of intellectual knowledge. So Williams is assuming that the audience and the reader are very much like him rather. So this is a play written by an upper middle class writer. And he's very much from that kind of old money, isn't he? Those old families in America. And he's writing almost from the type of family that Blanche came from, and assuming that you too are intelligent, educated, middle to middle or upper class. So if you think about that, he's writing a play about people that he doesn't belong to, rather like they're specimens in a petri dish. So when we move on in a second to this really, really vivid description of these men, he's not suggesting he knows about them because he's one of them, but because he's studied them. And he did live in New Orleans and write about these people. There's something a little bit uncomfortable about that, isn't there? Writing about people as if they're subjects. In the same way, when you've done your prose studies, you've written about how Hosseini writes 1,000 Splendid Suns for a white middle class audience, but it's actually about working class Afghan people. There's something a bit uncomfortable about writers doing that. Okay, so let's move on into the stage direction. The kitchen now suggests that sort of lurid, nocturnal brilliance. Now, lurid means too bright to the point where it's almost sleazy. And the word lurid is used several times in the play. So it's obviously something that Williams thinks really sums up this world. Nocturnal brilliance, the raw colours of childhood spectrum. So presumably he's talking there about bright primary colours. It makes me think of kind of fairground, the idea of nocturnal brilliance. It's very bright, very gaudy, but not very classy, more like sleazy. Over the yellow linoleum of the kitchen table hangs an electric bulb with a vivid green glass shade. Again, so you've got brightness, bright primary colours. So he's suggesting that these men are almost childlike in some way. The poker players, Stanley, Steve, Mitch and Pablo, wear coloured shirts, solid blues, purple, red and white check, light green, and they are men at the peak of their physical manhood. Now there's a couple of things going on here. Firstly, the green glass shade is something that you would have in a professional gambling environment. It's the kind of light shade that you would have over an actual pool table or a card table because it reduces the glare from the cards or the pool balls. And then if you look at the coloured shirts that the men are wearing, they're varied. And so there's a real vivacity to this scene. Vivacity meaning, sorry, let me spell that correctly, full of life, and that goes with the fact that these are men at the peak of their physical manhood. So this is an entirely masculine environment, and that obviously becomes evident later in the scene when the women are not welcome. They are coarse, which means uncultured, and often relates to language, often relates to swearing and things like that. Although the dialogue doesn't always reflect that. Direct and powerful as primary colours. So again, there's this repetition of the idea of this colour palette, which suggests they are powerful, vivacious, but also childlike in some ways. It's like they've been reduced down to their basic nature. So you remember when you go up the stairs to the apartment at the beginning in the first scene, and we talked about whether that might be indicative of a kind of ascension. It's almost like New Orleans reduces people to this microcosm where everything is displayed in its most basic element, everything is true to its own self. And you get the caveman attitudes of Stanley at the beginning, the toxic masculinity and arguably the toxic femininity of Blanche. There are vivid slices of watermelon, so again we've got vivid repeated. Again, the idea of brightness and vivacity. The word comes from the same root of watermelon on the table, whiskey bottles and glasses. And throughout the play, and if you listen to my analysis of scene 10, I've talked about how much the impact of alcohol is mentioned. Now, Williams was an alcoholic. In fact, he died of alcoholism. His family had a number of alcoholics in it. It really impacted his young life as well. So I do think part of the play is about the impact of alcohol on people and on families. The bedroom is relatively dim, with only the light that spills between the portieres. They're those kind of doors that you get in a cowboy film, like doors with sort of slits that light could come through, and through the wide window onto the street. So there's a difference in the quality of light between where the women are in the bedroom and the vivid light where the men are. For a minute there's an absorbed silence as a hand is dealt. So you go from this noise of the street cellar at the beginning to absorbed silence, where people are kind of thinking. So there's a real contrast there. Within a few seconds, there's contrast in the diegetic sound. And then always the first line of any scene is going to be really significant, isn't it? Anything wild, this deal. So that's the kind of card that you're playing. You have a wild card that has a particular special value. But for Steve to be asking, are we expecting anything wild, you know, at the moment, shows that the men, it's a foreshadowing, isn't it, of what's going to happen later in the scene with the wildness, the aggression and the violence in the scene. And then the rest of the conversation is fairly innocuous, just related to the game playing, setting the scene and establishing the game, which is important because that then contrasts with the disruption of the game later. And I think probably the most significant line here is down here, so I'm pointing at something you can't see, where they're saying what cards they want. Mitch says he's out quite early, so he's not a risk taker. Steve, on the other hand, asks for 2 cards. And Mitch, anyone want a shot? He means of alcohol. Stanley, yeah, me. So we see straight away Stanley absorbed by the alcohol. So if you think about how Williams has related this very ordinary, very commonplace, very masculine activity to quite a obscure Van Gogh painting, there's a sense that we're looking at these men like they're in a gallery, like we're spying on them almost, like we're being given a window into their lives. And Williams has got a fascination with their masculinity and the way that that plays out. So if you were to get a question about any of these characters, or about masculinity, you know, or about the way in which he uses symbolism, you could talk about the intertextual reference, you could talk about the use of sound and how that changes as the scene begins. This will be a really, really useful scene to refer to.